What can be the unifying moral to our much-needed societal change? Something that's secular and naturalistic, free from the myopic view of the world we live by today. Hi, this is Takatoshi Shibayama, the host of the Future Design Podcast. In this episode, Jamie Woodhouse, a community builder of Sentientism, talks to us about what can be the basis of our culture that allow us to reconsider issues such as climate change and unjust treatment to each other and the species that we live with on this earth. We dive into the philosophy of Sentientism that is based on evidence, reason, and moral consideration for all sentient beings. So stick around to the end.
Future Design Podcast.
Jamie, thank you very much for being on our show, Future Design Podcast. We talk about things, people improving ourselves to create a better future for humanity and the rest of the world. And I found you on, online. You were talking about sentientism, which I think was a huge upgrade for humanism, huge upgrade for veganism. And it really wanted to talk to you about what your thinking is behind all this movement that you're trying to create at the moment. We're going through a lot of difficulties in terms of humanity and the planet itself, and we definitely need more people like yourselves to be out in public talking about it. So can we just dive right into what sentientism is, because it's not a very familiar word that people are used to.
Yeah, no, it's great to be here. Thanks for the invite. And
Thank you.
Good to be able to talk about sentientism. It has too many syllables. It's a little difficult to say, but it's essentially the word sentient ism on the end. And I was nervous about creating and yet another ism. We have lots already, but I think this one's important. So we'll see if your viewers and listeners agree. So in simple terms, sentientism is trying to answer what I think are the two most important philosophical questions. What should we believe in? What's true, what is real? But also what should we care about morally? What matters morally, and by extension, what doesn't? And the clue to the second part of the question is in the name. So sentientism, when it thinks about what should we care about morally, says we should care about anything that's sentient. And sentience is the capacity to have experiences. Those are typically either good experiences, which we might call flourishing or well-being, or bad experiences, which generally we'd call suffering. So sentientism very simply says, when we're thinking about what should matter morally, however we make our decisions, every being that is capable of suffering or flourishing, we should grant them some moral consideration. We should have compassion for them. So that's where the word sentientism comes from, if you like. That's, our moral circle should include everything that can suffer. There's no type of suffering we should exclude. So that's one side of it. The other side, how should we choose what to believe, is very similar to secular humanism or a sort of naturalistic worldview that says there is a physical world, there's a reality that we're all part of, there's matter, there's energy, of course there's dark energy and dark matter as well, and lots of things we don't understand, and there's information processing, and it's breathtakingly complex and rich and very hard to understand, and maybe there will be limits to our understanding, but that's all there is. We're a part of a naturalistic world, and using evidence of that reality and reasoning about it is the only viable way of developing reliable, useful, true knowledge. So that naturalistic side then rejects supernatural beliefs, rejects religious beliefs, and just says we should use evidence and reason to decide what to believe in. And that belief, outside of formal systems like maths, is never 100% perfect. It's never 100% confident. Like any good science, it's always provisional and probabilistic, and we're always open to new evidence. But that's the way forward when trying to decide what to believe in. So that can sound quite obvious in a way. You might summarize it as it's a worldview that's committed to evidence, reason, and having compassion for all sentient beings. But as you hinted earlier on, it can have some quite radical implications for personal decisions, for institutional policies, for human and animal rights, for animal advocacy, and for how we try and make the world and the universe a better place. So maybe we can go through some of those implications as we talk.
Yeah, for sure. And what I kind of think, what you touched upon there is that you want to be secular, and you also want to be evidence-based. And not that I'm trying to disagree. I'm just playing the devil's advocate here as well. Is that science is still immature, right? I mean, we're still discovering so many things as we go, and not everything that we can actually find in this world that makes sense can be found with evidence, and neither can religion itself. I mean, I think religion has its good things. Obviously, all religions teach us to be compassionate and treat each other well, and all these beautiful things that are attached to it. Obviously, the people who actually become too fundamentalist about it, or who believes way too much and there's not much bandwidth for them to accept others that have different beliefs, can fall into the trap of being less compassionate, less tolerant of each other. So when you talk about let's focus more on being evidence-based and let's take out religion out of the equation, are you taking out the fact that you're taking even the good things and bad things out of it?
I'd put it this way: rather, I don't think sentientism is anti-religion, and it's not anti the supernatural. Most sentientists, and there are many different types and varieties of us, have a deep appreciation for many of the good things that sit within religious worldview. So, as you say, compassion, lots of different varieties of the golden rule about doing to others as you would like to be treated. So, there's many good things that flow through religious ways of thinking. All it does is it says, and it also doesn't explicitly say, there is no God, there is no supernatural, there is no spirit, there is no heaven or hell. It just says, if there's no evidence for something, no good evidence for something, we just don't believe it. So it's more of an absence of belief than it is explicitly saying we are 100% confident that there is no supernatural deity, if that makes sense.
So it's more about the ethics that you're more focused on rather than the,
but it is both, right? And in a way, that's part of the start. So when many people criticize a naturalistic or a scientific point of view, and they're slightly different, but they do relate. Science is a sort of, it's like a formal way of being naturalistic, but it's not the only way of having naturalistic views. I have very good evidence that my laptop is here. Right? I haven't done any science, right? I'm just experiencing it. That's pretty good evidence. So naturalism is broader. But when many people criticize naturalism and science, I think they're criticizing a straw man because they're pretending that science thinks it's perfect. They're pretending science thinks it has all of the answers and that those answers are incontrovertible and can never be challenged. And that's almost exactly the opposite of a naturalistic worldview. A naturalistic worldview says, we don't really know. We have this evidence. It is partial. It's provisional. We may find new things. But based on what we have seen, is a probabilistic view, a confidence-based level of view of what we think is likely to be real. But it's very rarely, if ever, completely confident. And that's the power of a naturalistic view, is that because it can take in new evidence, take in new ideas, and self-correct and fix its errors, and there are many errors in science and naturalism over its history, that's its power, because it is inexorably, it's never right, but it's always trying to get less wrong. Whereas other belief systems tend to ossify because they're fixed around some sort of set dogma that it's very difficult to challenge. So the situation with established religions and religious worldviews, on the one hand, it's absolutely welcoming that sort of universal compassion wherever that comes from. If someone has a universal broad compassion, whether that's for supernatural reasons, whether it's mandated by a deity, or whether it's come from their own evolved sense of what's good and bad, I think we welcome that compassion. We would still say, okay, but we think your beliefs are highly likely to be wrong because there's no good evidence for them. So there is still an epistemological disagreement there. But as you say, the most important thing is the ethics. And I think while many people of a religious mindset or a supernatural mindset can have really strong compassionate ethics, you do often see, as you hinted at, you see problems leaking in. And it's very hard to avoid those problems. So some of those problems, for example, can be that even if you have a universal broad compassion for the suffering and the flourishing, the life and death of other humans and non-human animals, in many religious systems, that's not the most important thing. Ultimately, the most important thing is the deity. That's even more important than people. And often also in the priority list is the religious organization itself and its reputation, the priests of the organization, and so you get to a position where suffering, flourishing, life and death, which to sentientism are the most important thing, in fact, the only thing that matters, often in a religious system get pushed down the priority list. And that can lead to, many of the practical ethical problems we see in real world religious organizations. There can also be in-out tribalism. That's often, the compassion is often conditional. So we have compassion for people in our church, but the apostates or the non-believers, might be subject to the death penalty in the current world or might burn in hell in the future world. Right? Neither of those are particularly compassionate outcomes. So there are many positive threads that run through most religions, but I think the positive threads generally predate all of those religions across many cultures and many regions and many schools of thought. Those positive threads have flowed through religions and often been adapted and sometimes warped by them. And none of the positive elements of the religions depend on the supernatural. So you could imagine a religion which takes out any sexism, any homophobia, any racism, any cruel and unusual punishments in this life or the afterworld, and you could strip out all of those ethical problems to be left with something which is based on universal compassion. But then I'm not sure why you'd need the supernatural at all. But many religions have followed that path, right? So when you look at the Christian Church of Quakerism, it's actually got quite close to that state already. Some schools of Buddhism also, although it's not technically original, as I think you said in one of your previous episodes, have much in common with that sort of rationalistic, compassionate stance. The Jain religion does as well. But even in those churches, those sort of more modern churches, ones that have evolved towards a, frankly, humanistic or sentientistic view, you can still see some issues popping up. So those are the two challenges with religion, to my mind. One is epistemological, right? The beliefs are supernatural, poorly founded, fabricated, and therefore largely arbitrary, which is a problem in its own right. But then practically, that then leads into some often very, very problematic ethics, which we're struggling with on the world stage on a daily basis.
Yeah. I think religion really has really deep roots into culture as well. So that's why you do see the sexism or ageisms or, many of the problems that we see with religion. And because it roots from that cultural aspect of it, back in the days, I guess, when somebody wants to teach you something, whether it be Buddha or Jesus, they need to tailor it so that it fits within that culture. And they'll bring in the culturalistic aspects of it so that it can scale in a more technological sense, and therefore people can really latch onto the idea because it kind of sorts to fit into their culture. And for me, going forward, when we talk about sentientism or any type of wave of schools of thought, for me, I find that putting a category into something as an ism or an ist of something really ostracates the other people's ways of thinking, and I think that also creates certain conflicts with people. If you say I only believe this way, that is the ism, right? And for you, when you launch this thing, you probably thought through what is the best word to go for it. But is there a particular reason that you added in the ism into your thinking?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't invent the term, actually. It originally came out of the animal advocacy and animal ethics movement in the 1970s. So there are probably two philosophers who originally developed the term, a chap called Peter Singer and another called Richard Ryder, a British psychologist. But the term was originally used in quite a derogatory sense by another philosopher who was criticizing their work. So he was almost saying that they were putting forward the view that you should grant moral consideration based on sentience. So they were saying, we care about the suffering of other humans, but non-human animals suffer too. Surely we should care about them because we have a common evolutionary basis. Their suffering is maybe different from human suffering, but it has a related quality that is just as morally important. So they were arguing for us to extend our moral circle beyond humans to include certainly most non-human animals. And they were criticized by that, by another chap called John Rodman, who said, we have racism, we have sexism. This is just a type of sentientism because you're discriminating against things that can't suffer. But in a way, they've then took the term and re-owned it and said, well, yes, we are. That's the whole point. The whole point of this discrimination is that we morally care about everything capable of suffering, but things that can't suffer. So why should we care about them? A rock or a plant or they might be important because of their impact on humans or non-human animals, but in themselves, a rock has no moral salience in itself. So they've then sort of took the term back and said, yes, that it is discriminatory, but it's the only valid form of discrimination. Because if morality is about suffering and flourishing, then we should care about all the things that can suffer and flourish. But all I've done in the last couple of years is their philosophy was always naturalistic. So it was always set up as an alternative to a sort of religious moral system. So they were applying science and evidence and reason in working out what sentience was and judging what types of beings and species are sentient. It was always naturalistic in that narrow sense. And all I've really done is recast it to say, in the same way as humanism is about evidence and reason, so that's another ism, just as humanism is about evidence and reason and compassion for all humans, let's take this and extend that. Say, well, we're also about evidence and reason in every respect of life, but instead of extending our moral compassion for humans, we extend it to all sentience. So in a way, it was taking that term that came out of the animal advocacy movement, also looking at secular humanism. I count myself as a humanist too, but being frustrated that humanism is too anthropocentric, it's too focused on humans, almost exclusively. So that frustration with humanism and that pre-existing term that led me to say, okay, this idea, yes, it's an ism, and there are too many already, and there is a risk of it feeling exclusionary, but it focuses on what is morally salient, and that is sentience, the capacity to suffer and flourish. So that was the background for it. The other thing I've been very keen to do in my writing and my speaking is to keep it very, very simple. So this isn't a fully developed philosophy that will answer every philosophical trolley problem and trade-off and policy issue. It doesn't tell you the answers to all of those things. All it says is commit to evidence and reason in deciding what to believe, and commit to having compassion for all sentient beings. So the idea being it's so simple and so basic and such a fundamental platform, it could even potentially have universal application, because as long as someone's committed to using evidence and reason, they might still disagree on the conclusions. They might still have conflicting evidence. They might still reason about things in different ways. But as long as, in principle, everyone's committed to engaging with reality to develop our understanding of reality, and as long as everyone recognizes that there's no type of suffering or no suffering being that we should ignore or deliberately try to harm or kill, hopefully those two very simple foundation stones are at a low enough base that it has universal potential. But as you say, that it still will exclude. If someone says, yes, there is good evidence that that animal is capable of suffering, but I do not have any compassion for them, so I'm happy to kill them. Well, then, yeah, you're not a sentientist. So, by definition, or if someone says, I get what you're saying about evidence and reason, and I apply that myself in most of my life, as everybody does, religious people or not. But I do believe in this sort of revelation from a holy book, or something my parents or my priest told me, that there is a supernatural being, and no, I don't have any evidence for it that's would be robust in a normal setting. Well, then they're not sentientists either. But the important thing is sentientism has compassion for those people too, right? And I have to remind many people in the animal advocacy movement and many people in the atheist and humanist movements is that you have to have universal compassion, even for the people you disagree with, even for the people that might be harming animals, or even the people that might be fundamentalist religion and might have harmful ethics. Universal compassion means universal compassion. So we'd welcome compassion from any source, even if it's supernaturally motivated, that person wouldn't necessarily count themselves as a sentientist, if that
Yeah.
makes sense.
I was thinking more in terms of climate change and the impact that it has, and I'm not talking particularly about the developed countries, because they have risen to a certain level that we can choose whether we want to eat animal protein or not, and choose the way we consume things. But I live in Singapore. I'm surrounded by countries that are still growing, and they haven't even tasted their first animal protein. There are people like that, and what is it that you can say that? Well, I think for us, I don't want to be on a high horse telling them that they shouldn't be able to experience the things that we have as people from developed countries have experienced. The industrialization, the abundance of animal protein that we're able to eat, and being able to urbanize a lot of the landscapes that we have, so that we have this beautiful high technological life that we live in right now. And for us to just go down to these countries around here and say, well, too bad, you we messed things up already, I'm sorry, well, so now it's about sentientism, so you got to forget about urbanizing, you got to forget about eating animal protein. I mean, what do you have to say about that?
It's a really important counter, because and we will get into areas where sentientism is neutral on those answers, but I have a personal opinion, and I have to remind myself of that, right? Sentientism is just those two things: evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. So there's much scope for disagreement beyond that. I think the starting point in those conversations has to be compassion for those people, right? And universal compassion for those people. And that means recognizing their interests and their needs, what makes them happy, what makes them suffer, and wanting the best for them in whatever respect, right? And respecting that it's, they have probably the best personal judgment about what is good for them, right? So that's the starting point. It's not about restricting people, and it's not about challenging people. It's most sentientists would want reduction of suffering and enhanced flourishing for everybody. Now, because, and again, I can't speak for all sentientists, because there's a breathtaking diversity of opinions, right, across the political spectrum, across the economic spectrum, across the technological spectrum. But because we're quite committed to evidence and reason, we tend to be quite positive about using science and technology and innovation of ways of reducing suffering and enhancing flourishing. So that leads on to one of the topics that I know you've covered in some of your previous episodes about, are there ways of finding more ethical, more climate friendly ways of meeting those needs, whether it's the people wanting to eat meat and shellfish through technology, that mean you've resolved the trade-off, right? And it's the best of all worlds, because you've radically reduced the suffering of the non-human animals involved, you've improved the climate situation, but you haven't constrained or undermined what those individuals would want. So that's part of the idea, is it's not trying to restrict technology. It's actually, I think most scientists would want to be quite bullish about sensibly using technology to resolve some of those trade-offs. But at the same time, you will hear people using a cultural or religious tradition to justify something that just very clearly is ethically wrong. And I think most sentientists will take quite a strong stance there. And they'll say, look, I respect you might have an indigenous tradition or a religious tradition or a cultural tradition that doing these things is normal and natural, and you get pleasure from doing them. You have a sense of social solidarity and respecting ancestral tradition. But if the harms if what that's leading you to do is causing harm to other sentient beings, whether they're other humans or other non-human animals, there is a strong ethical rationale for not doing that. So while some people who are otherwise compassionate and have quite modern ethics are very, very hesitant about challenging other cultures, personally, I'm not, right? So I've had conversations with otherwise very socially liberal people who refuse to condemn the practice in some countries of throwing homosexual people off roofs to their deaths, right? And this otherwise very socially liberal person cannot bring themselves to condemn it, because they're nervous about appearing colonial and imposing our culture on somebody else, and who are we to judge? And to my mind, that sort of relativism is deeply insidious, right? There are some ethical fundamentals about suffering and flourishing and life and death that we should be unashamed about trying to put forward, actually regardless of indigenous or cultural or religious traditions. Now, we can still have a breathtaking diversity of art, culture, music, schools of thought, even naturalistic spirituality. A sentientist government wouldn't ban religion; it would be secular. So you could believe what you liked, you could have freedom of belief, you could be as weird as you like, right? But the ethical stance has to be pretty clear, right? Suffering is a bad thing, flourishing is a good thing. If your beliefs or your traditions lead you to practices that needlessly cause suffering or death to other sentient beings, then we take a pretty hard line. So does that
it makes sense. Look, I mean, in my country, in Japan, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners and you obviously know this, but there was this documentary called The Cove. There's a fisherman village in Japan called Taiji, and all these fishermen go out and hunt all these dolphins. And their reasoning is that it takes away their livelihood because all these dolphins are eating the fish that they're trying to catch. So if you go back into this sentientism and then we approach this problem, what would we have to tell them? Because we have to say, okay, you can't kill dolphins. Moreover, you can't even kill the fish that you're trying to get. So we have to throw your livelihoods away and go find another job. Now, but then you have to tell these people who are probably in their late 50s or 60s who can't get another job, right? So how do you go to certain industries or certain cultures or certain societies where their whole livelihood is based on killing animals or deforestation or some things that we can't really agree upon?
It's a massive problem, and as you say, it's not one of the interesting things about the Cove is that there is also a massive ethical outcry around the world about this going on, when arguably it's not really that different from what happens in every factory farm in almost every country around the world, yet that is something acceptable that people are comfortable buying from. So there is a breathtaking disconnect in people's logical thinking about which types of species count and which don't. So generally, most people, and I'll come back to your question because it's a deeply important one. So most people will see, dolphins, charismatic wildlife, dogs, pets and companions as not as important as humans, but certainly important enough that you would see harming or killing them as a very serious wrongdoing. Although that varies across cultures. But farmed animals or vermin or other types of non-charismatic wild animals are basically granted zero moral consideration. So even though a pig and a dog have very similar intellects, and arguably a pig, certainly with my dog, she's less intelligent than the average pig. But there's no logical reason to make that distinction. It's a cultural and societal thing that we've learned that these things are normal, and I have to remind myself of that because for many, many years of my life, I was in a deep state of cognitive dissonance around these things where I knew ethically and logically there was no justification for it, but I still participated. So that's one of the things we're trying to counter with sentientism, is at least bring a more rational view to what our ethics should be. It doesn't mean you automatically solve the problems, but you do acknowledge that, yes, fish are sentient, yes, dolphins are sentient, yes, pigs and dogs are sentient, yes, human babies are sentient. So causing them suffering or death is a moral negative. Now, can you do that immediately tomorrow? Probably not. Are there many other considerations you need to bear in mind as you try and reduce suffering? Absolutely. Is even being a vegan an ethically perfect state? Absolutely not, right? Arable farming and all sorts of other things we do cause harm and suffering. So we shouldn't let the fact that these things are hard or that we can't attain perfection stop us from reducing suffering over time and trying to make things better. But that does lead into very difficult challenges like the one you laid out. And we have to have compassion for those people in helping the transition happen. There are some in the animal advocacy movement who will look on people who do fishing or farming or bullfighting or fur trapping or hunting as deeply evil, almost like the enemy, like a virus that needs to be eradicated. So some parts of the animal advocacy movement, and I understand why, right? Because these are serious moral wrongs, end up actually feeling very negative about the human race or certain parts of the human race. But we have to have compassion for humans too, because humans are sentient as well, right? And these people have livelihoods and cultures and preferences that you can't just wave a magic wand and trash. But I think the answer has to be one where we use evidence and reason to work out the best way forward. So the sorts of ideas, and you can see this happening particularly around factory farming and cattle ranching and pig farming, is about helping those people who have livelihoods that depend on causing catastrophic harm and environmental damage, helping them transition. So you'll see cattle ranchers switching to oat milk production. You'll see people thinking about taking government subsidies, which are often, billions of taxpayers' dollars and yen and pounds are pushed into animal farming to subsidize it, instead using those subsidies to help switch to plant-based agriculture or clean meat technologies. And I'm not pretending this is easy, but we have to stop thinking that harm, both the direct harm caused to the non-human animals, and also the environmental harms, which are absolutely catastrophic, we have to break the taboo and recognize that those are bad things. That doesn't mean the answers are easy, but if we use evidence, reason, technology, and shift policy to help those people who are involved in those industries transition, we can make phenomenal change happen. But it won't be easy, and it will take time.
For sure. I could totally see that. And these are policy changes as well, whether it be from the government side and these things have to be a universally concerted efforts that happen pretty much at the same time, because if there are countries that are still dependent on or still looking at growth for their economy and they want to keep doing what they want to do, and then there are others are turning more sentientism and say, let's switch on to something more greener or sentient driven kind of mentality. It's very hard, and I have this conversation with a lot of people who are working in the kind of clean tech or circular economy and all these people. And one of the questions that usually pops out for people who are a little bit skeptic around these ideas is that, are you thinking about creating a global economy that is based out of growth? Do we have to degrowth our economy so that we switch to something else? There's a lot of hopes and desires and almost religious faith in capitalism that they think that this is the way it has to be, and a lot of people can't think outside the box. Even if they do, there's a lot of criticism saying, "Oh, you're a Marxist and you're thinking in a very different mind frame." But socialism and this circular economy kind of thing is quite different in my view. But it's always a polarizing view. Are you a capitalist? Are you a socialist? And it always has to be that way. The conversation is always that way, right? So how can we kind of talk about these things in a more non-polarized way?
So I think there's three points there. One is I agree. Just saying to developing economies and countries, you can't do what we did. You can't develop. You can't grow. I think is a deeply wrong thing to do, because we need to have compassion for the billions of people in those countries, and it would just be searingly arrogant for us to have followed an aggressively industrialized path, made ourselves all rich and comfortable, and then say, now because of the climate you have to stop, or because of ethics you have to stop. But encouragingly, what I'm hoping is that because of new developments in technology, many of those countries will find an alternative path. And you can see hints of it already, whether it's around animal agriculture, and there's some really interesting Chinese and Japanese and Indian ventures that are developing clean meat technologies, or whether it's around climate change, where again, across a lot of the African continent, people are finding a different way to have decentralized energy solutions that don't just follow, let's build loads of coal-fired power stations. So what I'm hoping is that rather than, the developed economies arrogantly telling developing economies what to do, the developing economies themselves have such a level of ethical and technical advancement, they'll find a better path anyway, both on the climate and both ethically, that will enable us to have something that is more sustainable, more ethical, but actually will still give all of the benefits of wealth and prosperity and freedom to their people. That's the hope. I mean, it may sound a little naively optimistic, but I do think that's the route we're going to see those countries taking. And it won't be because the developed countries have told them to do it. It's because the path the developed countries followed was deeply flawed and problematic, and the developing countries have got much better ideas. So I'm hoping that will happen. That's certainly true on the climate change side, and I'm hoping will be true of animal agriculture as well. On the degrowth argument, I think that links in because, again, I'll tell you my personal view here, but Sentientists have a breathtaking array of views politically and economically. They all share that naturalistic stance and that compassionate stance. But there are sentientists who are anarchists, who are socialists, who are communists, who are capitalists, who are amazingly, they still all talk to each other, which is one of the things I've found really encouraging so far, because they just have very different ways of that they think we should make the world better, but they all want to make the world better for compassionate reasons. And they all have different evidence bases, of course, and maybe they'll converge over time because they'll share that evidence. But it's very, very broad. Nearly everyone is socially liberal, of course, because if you have a sentientist point of view and that compassionate point of view, you can't be a racist or a sexist or a homophobe, right? So they're all socially liberal, but across the economic, political spectrum and different ways of organizing, it's a breathtaking diversity. Now, there are some, and this is a part of a problem, I think, in the wider environmental movement, who insist that degrowth and destroying capitalism is the only viable way of having a sustainable world. And I have some empathy with that, but too often that point of view seems to come from people who themselves are already quite comfortable and living in quite developed economies where they already have,
rich people want socialism for them, right?
Absolutely. And it almost does become what you suggested before, which is like, right, I've got what I need. Now we need degrowth. But degrowth and destroying capitalism, unfortunately, tends to hurt the poorest most, right? So I know people are skeptical about GNP and GDP and these economic numbers. They seem a bit abstruse. They measure the wrong things often. But it's still true that if an economy goes into depression or recession, it is the poorest that get hurt the hardest, and it's the poorest countries that get hurt the hardest. So for environmentalists who say, we need aggressive degrowth and we need to take the human population back down to 5 billion, I'm really nervous about where their ethical mindset is taking them. And I think if you offset that with a proper evidence base and a genuinely compassionate point of view where you really want all of the people around the world to flourish, some sentientists will disagree with me, but I don't think that takes you to a degrowth place. I think that takes you to a place where we still need growth. We do need to adjust our indicators of what good is to include well-being and flourishing, and not just have things focused on raw economic measures. That's absolutely sensible. But we need to use innovation and new technologies and new philosophies to enable us to keep growing and keep helping people be better off at the same time, not go to a sort of turn back the clock, rewind, degrowth, depopulate, that I think can have some deeply serious ethical implications. I've gone on too long, but hopefully that's...
No, not at all. I mean, what I always think about people who advocate for more socialism, or especially people who talk about universal basic income, is that too often they forget about that the economy needs to keep going to generate that surplus to distribute that wealth. And some countries are well equipped to do that. Let's say like Norway, where they have so much oil reserves that they can redistribute it. That's why they have a very very well structured welfare state. But as in certain countries, I mean, obviously you can't do that. And unless you keep that economy somewhat in growth mode, you can't also be able to subsidize certain industries to move on to another one, or tell certain industries to stop doing what they're doing, don't make too many plastics, and then why don't you invest in something more? But maybe, in a corporate structure, you can't really do that because you got to go for things that you actually make money the most. Otherwise, you have millions of shareholders to answer to, and also you might have to lay off some employees because you're doing that. I mean, there's a lot of complications on saying, let's turn this into a more circular economy, and let's think about more of the planetary issues. So there's so many moving parts and so many variables that we have to think about in moving towards that direction.
Yeah.
And it almost, for an individual, like any one individual or any consumer that's out there who are very concerned about these issues, it almost ends up in despair because there's really not much they can do by themselves, right? So what is a way that you think that each and one of us can actually start making an impact, or at least start the conversation, drive the conversation, get communities going, maybe talk to local governments, etc. I mean, is there a way that we can do this?
I think there is, and it's not easy, and there's much disagreement about how. But I think every individual, there's many things you can do, because while as an individual, there are 8 billion people on the planet, so it might feel like you can't make a difference. Even a tiny difference is still a difference, right? So I would still encourage people to think about their own behaviour or their own consumption and the things they do to try and move towards some solutions that cause less suffering, cause less environmental damage, help other people. And there are many different things you can do around that, whether it's going vegan, whether it's taking a different sets of decisions. But actually, more importantly, is how each of those individuals plays a role in institutional or policy or governmental change. Because generally, as you mentioned before, actually it's the policy and the institutional change level where the real power is.
Yes.
But those governments are voted for by voters. Those institutions are staffed by people. They listen to varying degrees. So I think if each individual thinks about their own decisions, but also thinks about how they can influence those institutions through voting, through policy suggestions, through lobbying, through protesting, through writing to corporations, through their own leadership role in creating new NGOs or being managers in organizations. If you apply this mindset, an evidence and reason-based mindset and a compassionate mindset to all of those different levels, I think you can see institutional change happen too. And that's when change can happen very rapidly, because if we wait for all 8 billion people around the world to consume ethically, it's never going to happen. What you need is individual consumers making decisions and individual voters making decisions, but you also need governments redirecting subsidies, applying intelligent taxation around climate change or ethical externalities, carbon taxes. You need corporations playing a role of providing the right products and services in an efficient and effective way. So you need all of the different pieces to pull together. But when they do that, I think change can happen very rapidly. While we've talked about sort of two of the major areas about resisting supernatural or religiously motivated harms, and there's all sorts of campaigning organizations people can get involved in there to help people either leave religions or to get religions to soften their stances to be more ethical, to persuade more countries to be secular rather than theocratic. There's lots of brilliant campaigning organizations people can get involved in there. There's clearly the animal advocacy movement as well. People can take direct decisions around what they consume and what they buy and what they wear, but there are also organizations that are campaigning around making animal law actually protect animals rather than just enabling animal agriculture, around transitioning animal agriculture and fishing into different types of industries. There's an enormous swathe of brilliant organizations there that people can get involved in. But more generally, this sort of naturalistic approach of just applying evidence and reason, whether it's scientific or whether it's personal thinking, to almost every problem, gives us a slightly better chance of getting the right answers. So one of the things, if people want to come and explore the sentientism.info website, we're starting to build out some thoughts about what these policy implications might be, what these campaigns are, the organizations that are working in these different areas, and things individual people can do themselves too. But there's an enormous swathe.
Yeah. And you've been in the management consulting industry for about 25 years, and now you've started these movements. I mean, what actually, because you're probably at the top of your game during that time, and there must have been something that driven you to start this movement. And I guess you're doing this full time at the moment. I mean, why is it that you felt so passionate about this?
It was a confluence of two things, really. I've long been interested in the sort of atheist humanist movements and been part of those, and been very interested in the influence of religion and supernatural thinking on ethics generally. Almost as a separate thread, I became interested in vegetarianism and veganism and animal ethics and animal rights, albeit a bit later in life. And it was partly my frustration with some of the humanist movements that led me to, do some more reading and study and linking the two together. That was what led me to, finding this term that has been around since the 1970s and thinking, can't I take the strengths of secular humanism, the fact it's universal, that it's broad, that it's compassionate, that it's based on evidence and reason, but fix that problem that it's too restricted to humans and layer in non-human animals, and even slightly weirdly be conceptually open to the possibility that one day we might even have sentient AI or other forms of non-biological sentient. So it was really a philosophical fascination, it's almost an academic fascination, but then a practical one as well. And I do think that if we can get to a point where more people are committed to evidence and reason and have that universal compassion as a basic worldview, that makes every single decision every single person takes better than it would otherwise have been. And it just improves our chance of making the world a better place. And there's nothing more important than that. So yeah, I was a consultant by trade like you, and was a partner in one of the big global firms for a long while. I still do some consulting now as well, but it's a little bit more ad hoc around projects such as this and some other NGO and charity projects I do as well. So it was really just a shift in emphasis and priority to focus on, it seems embarrassing to say it, but what I think is the most important thing.
Right. Yeah, I totally agree. And how many people are behind this movement? I mean, is there like a political movement that's happening behind your organization? I mean, how do people get involved?
There isn't an organization. There's no membership. There's no fees. There's no money. There's no governance. There's no nothing. And that's quite deliberate because it's just a worldview, really, right? Yeah. So people might subscribe to it or not. They might agree with it or disagree with it, but it's just a worldview, like humanism or like some of the other isms. And I wanted to keep it that way. I don't want it to become something that's restrictive or there are a long list of rules or. But at the same time, you could argue there's a movement growing up around it as well. So we've developed a series of online communities where people who are interested in the idea can come and talk. I've been doing, it's great to come on podcasts like this and spread the word a little bit more and writing articles about it. I've been engaging with academics and activists and who work in related fields and suggesting how we can integrate some of these fields, getting people who are doing AI ethics and animal ethics and epistemological philosophy to talk together and work together. So there's some academic threads to it as well. So in a sense that, and we are starting to think about, what are the implications of this view and what are all of the different campaigns and organizations and actions people can take to put those into practice. So if people are interested, the main home page is at sentientism.info, and I can send you some notes that you can put in the show notes if you like. Our main online community so far is on Facebook. That's just been the easiest place to run the group. There's over 1,000 people on that now from, I think, 90 different countries. So if you just search for Sentientism on Facebook, you'll find that. But we've also got a Discord and a Reddit and a LinkedIn group, and we're on most of the other platforms as well, although those aren't quite as busy. On the main website, we've also got a wall that it's been wonderful to see people adding pictures of themselves and personal messages to say why sentientism resonates with them. We've also been building up a page of celebrities and well-known people that we think have a sentientist worldview. So they've probably never heard of the word, but through a combination of their atheist humanistic outlook and the fact they're very serious about animal ethics too, we're sort of taking an implication that if they heard about sentientism, they might subscribe. So there's some fascinating figures from from the world of screen and celebrity and academia that we already think this way.
Oh, great!
But those would be the main things. I'd say go to sentientism.info and just search for the word sentientism, and you'll find the different Facebook groups and forums and writing and speaking. So.
Yeah, well, definitely follow you for sure. I mean, we're already connected on Twitter. And, I think there's a lot of information that actually is on your website, especially that really long presentation that explains all the details about sentientism and how that affects the United Nations sustainability goals and such. And I found that very informative. Maybe that was...
I've rather cheekily rewritten the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as well to be a Universal Declaration of Sentient Rights. Yeah, so there's loads. I mean, the simple stuff is evidence, reason, and compassion for all sentient beings. But as you said, there's loads and loads of other rich content out there. And I'd love to hear people's feedback and ideas and challenges as well.
Awesome. Well, thank you very much for your time. I had a wonderful time speaking to you. And I think a lot of people will get more enlightened about the word sentientism and the ideas behind that. So thank you again.
That's great. I love the conversation. Great to meet you, Taka.
Hi, this is your host Takatoshi Shibayama. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. Now, if you enjoyed or disliked the show, please let me know by writing in the comment section. The only way I can improve or add value to you is through your voices. If there are any topics that you would like me to pick up, please also let me know in the comments. I'd love to start chatting with you all. And if you would like to continue watching the show, please subscribe. Thank you.